everybody. So at the end of the day, this has been a long 2 days. You guys are probably pretty tired, and I can't really see everybody because of the lights, but I have a thought just to sort of maybe get the energy up. How about everybody stands up? You can sit. Everybody stand up and just like move your arms around.
Oh, what the hell?
Right. I would put music on and dance, but I don't know what we have a license for. All right, so just like shake, 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 shake. All right. Somebody give me another idea for one more thing and we'll all do it. Okay, Susie, like this. All right. Very good. All right, give yourselves a hand. Thank you. All right, now are we awake? Good. I'm really happy to be here to talk to Bret. I'm sure that many of you have read things that he's written about these issues, about cancel culture, about the dying art of disagreement, one of my favorite pieces that he's written in the New York Times. I know we all know people, some people in this room even are in this situation where people are concerned about what they're seeing, about this illiberal ideology that has become the dominant narrative in K-12 education and higher education. And we see this problem of people not being willing to speak up, and not just in K-12 education, but also in higher education, professors, parents, students, even administrators. And even, Greg Lukianoff was talking about in business where CEOs are afraid of their employees, right? So what I want to ask Bret is, what are we seeing? What is this phenomenon that we're seeing?
Well, just to start provocatively, why not? We're seeing the resurgence of a kind of a totalitarian strain of thought. Not in every respect. I don't want to generalize or totalize in my answers. But anyone who's sort of studied the literature of 20th century, the literature about 20th century totalitarianism, hears very distinct and familiar echoes in terms of qualities of groupthink, qualities of doublethink, newspeak. I mean, all of these terms that we get from Orwell and other 20th century writers who sort of look closely at what the great progressive utopia of the 20th century really entailed in practice, see some parallels to today. Obviously, nowhere so repressive, nowhere near so severe, but the same quality of advocating progress, openness, and liberty in theory, and promoting a certain kind of illiberalism, censoriousness, and repressiveness in practice. And I think I suspect that's why you're here, that there is this profound disconnect between the words that are being used and the practices that are being employed that I think strikes all of us who care about the fate of liberalism, and I hope I can use that word and be understood in a room like this, the fate of the open society. It leaves all of us very disquieted, and I think it's past time that people start realizing that this is not going to go away on a breeze.
Say more about doublespeak. I know Natan Sharansky talked about that. Say more about what you're talking about and what you're seeing in the parallels.
Well, what Sharansky talks about is doublethink,
right.
Which I guess in the lingo of modern social scientists, you're more familiar with this, Pamela, than I am, is called preference falsification.
Exactly right, yeah.
People say things just to kind of get along, right? Because they think it is the expected thing to say in a given social environment. And all of us practice preference falsification. That's a lovely sweater you're wearing.
You can't see you.
I can't even see you, so I'm just making that up. But to the extent to which you hear, and I think many of us have had conversations in which people will mouth opinions rather strongly and then admit to feeling otherwise in their personal feelings. And why is that? Because they're afraid. They are afraid. And it tells you something. It's odd that we're living in the freest, ostensibly the freest society in history, where on an everyday basis, people are afraid of offering their opinions. Now, sometimes it's because their opinions are genuinely deplorable. I don't want to suggest that, the problem here is that, racist, the Klansmen can't speak. I mean, there are genuinely deplorable opinions. But people who hold opinions which are widely shared and are not deplorable, in fact, are consonant with the basic tenets of a democratic society, are afraid to speak up. And there's poll after poll. More in Common had a very extensive survey of this in 2018, which indicates that. And that's a genuine problem of democracy. Why are so many people in a free society so reluctant to offer a view?
Right. You're talking about, I don't know how many people here are familiar with More in Common, but they did two very large pieces of research which are really useful in looking at what we're seeing. The More in Common group is, I think, an international group of researchers, and they found that the proportion of people in the extremes on the right and the left is very small. I don't remember the exact numbers, something like 8% on one side, maybe 10 or 11% on the other side. And that the perception gap is really what the problem is, not the fact that we don't have things in common, but that the more extreme people are, the less accurate they are about what the other side thinks. The more extreme a person is themselves, the more they're likely to paint the other side as very extreme. And then, going along with something that Cass Sunstein understood is that the more we isolate ourselves and talk to only people that think like us, the more extreme and polarized we become. And so this is a self-perpetuating system. And preference falsification is this is Timur Kuran's idea or concept that we say things we don't believe in order to protect ourselves from what John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff called in their first article, The Coddling of the American Mind, vindictive. This is an example of vindictive protectiveness is what they're protecting, people protect themselves from, because others are vindictively protective of those they think are vulnerable by lashing out at people who say the wrong things. So people are self-protective and self-censorious in an effort to protect themselves from that sort of vindictive behavior. So now we're seeing, I'm sure all of you have had the experience of people talking to you in hushed tones, right? Or only when other people aren't around, they will allow themselves to reveal their true preferences, right? They will otherwise falsify them. This is one of the massive problems that you have in your parent bodies at your schools and even on your boards of trustees. People with donors, people with money, people with power are still afraid to say what they actually think. So, what do you think, what do you see? I know people talk to you. What are people afraid of?
Well, they're afraid of social retribution. They're afraid of awkward moments. They're afraid of being humiliated. They're afraid of being on the side of the bad people. So, I mean, look, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are good words, right? I mean, I don't think anyone in this room wants in any way to return to a world in which prep schools were all boys, all white, and basically all Christians, right? I mean, that's not the world we want. We support diversity, right? We want, to the extent that the word equity means fair play, which is the common English usage, we want fair play in our societies. And of course, we want inclusiveness. It's very hard to be against inclusiveness, except in the sense that these same elite schools that reject 93% of applicants are paradoxically trying to be inclusive. That's another story. So, very cleverly, the advocates of it have captured words that are hard to argue with, right? I mean, how can you, it's like being against sunshine mothers and wholesomeness, you know? You have to, so already in a semantic sense, you're on the back foot in terms of the argument. Second thing is, if you stand up and oppose this, people say, you sound just like Donald Trump. Right? So there's a quality of polarization in the argument that if you are against these things, you are not only mistaken, you're not only against good things, you're actually on the side of fascism or borderline fascism. So that's another aspect. Third aspect is people want to be nice, right? It is a natural human instinct that people want to be nice, and part of being nice is saying you have a lovely sweater. No, your sweater is ugly. You have no taste. You should immediately go home. You should you know. But so those are all, I think, features that make these arguments difficult. And I think if this is an argument, and if you want to turn the argument, you want to say, first of all, we too are on the side of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't think you are using those terms in a common sense and ordinary way. We also think you're using those terms dishonestly, and we want to use a fashionable verb, we want to interrogate precisely what you mean programmatically in terms of those terms. Because if the goal is diversity in the sense of genuine liberal openness, inclusion, which includes viewpoint diversity, it includes diversity according to metrics of class and other forms of diversity, that's one kind of argument, right? It's a very different thing when they actually say, well, the only diversity we mean is one particular form, and the only inclusiveness that we're really interested in is an inclusiveness that doesn't allow for a multiplicity of viewpoints. So, I mean, this thing is titled, How to Turn a Whisper into a Roar. I think one of the ways in which you do that is you have to reclaim the high ground of liberalism, okay? And I mean that sort of in the classical sense, and I actually also mean it almost in the more parochial or political sense. And one of the conversations that I most have is with people who I know would never vote for Republican, even if their child's life depended on it, wouldn't vote for a Republican. These are people who have always thought of themselves as Democrats, as supporters of civil rights, as supporters of fair play in society. And yet in one space after another, whether it's in school or in workplaces or other settings, what they're encountering isn't the liberalism they thought they were in favor of. What they're encountering isn't the liberalism of Martin Luther King Jr. At the Lincoln Memorial on the content of our character. What they are encountering increasingly is a hyper-racialized form of illiberalism that, you know, when you start to think about it, you think in an international context, this usually doesn't lead to good things, right? I mean, when we look at other societies which have hyper-tribalized themselves or hyper-racialized themselves, created us versus them dichotomies, the results are usually bad, whether it's in Indonesia between the Chinese and Indonesians, or in any other context, or in the American South, you know, in the Jim Crow South. That is what we've been trying to get away with for the last, away from in the last century, and it seems what we're slipping towards. So again, the goal is, you know, be curious, interrogate, say, well, what do you mean? And what is the programming behind that? And does it contain other points of view? And you'll find, I think, too often that the answer is, well, not really, because what we're really trying to do in the name of pedagogy is impose ideology.
Yeah, so that's, I think people are now calling that the critical pedagogy, right? Which, you know, obviously critical theory is sort of the pervasive dominant narrative in all spaces in education. And in fact, a lot of, I think Susie knows this probably better, and Beth and Ashley, that and Erica, a lot of the school systems have actually put in their goals that diversity, equity, and inclusion will be part of every part of the curriculum and the non-curricular, extracurricular programming, and it's supposed to be pervasive. That brings me to this question of, so people are afraid of being called names, of being seen as the bad guy. People are afraid of losing their friends, of losing their status, of losing their jobs, of their kids being kicked out. Susie was talking about how parents have no rights, really. They have to sign something that says your child can be kicked out for basically any reason we say. People are afraid of those things because they want their children to stay in the school, and they want their children to be able to get into the equally elite and selective colleges that these schools are supposed to be feeders for. That's what people are afraid of. And some of them are have serious ramifications. Kids being kicked out of school, having that on a record is a serious ramification. People losing their jobs, that's serious ramifications. But are those the things that we should be worried about, or should we be fearful of other things?
Look, I completely understand any parent who is thinking, just keep your mouth shut, right? Keep your mouth shut, move along, nod your head. That's how Natan Sharansky's family, survived that period. At the same time, if you detect a lump in your body, right, keeping your mouth shut is probably a bad strategy. And my fear is that what begins as a kind of a fairly soft approach, let us suggest some ideas for your curriculum, increasingly becomes rigid and doctrinaire. And it doesn't just exist in, say, a high school environment or in a college environment. It also exists in the workplace. So instead of sort of graduating into freedom, you are just creating the grounds for an ever more kind of repressive intellectual monoculture. And so at some point, if you live in a free country, you have an obligation to exercise that. And if you're a concerned parent and you would give your kidney to help a child, right, presumably you would give something, at least in terms of your reputational capital, in order to create educational environments that are genuinely challenging. One of this comes up with the word inclusion, right? Of course, how can you be against inclusion? We are for inclusion. Inclusion into what exactly? And that's a question I think that's worth raising. Are you being included into an educational environment of challenge or conformity? Are you being included into places where you are going to grow or where you're going to be coddled, right? And this is one of the things that really I think is a point. School is not church, okay? You go to church to have your beliefs affirmed, right? You go to church to have, and there's nothing wrong with it, by the way, or church or synagogue or mosque, I want to be inclusive, or wherever it may be. But you go to a house of worship in order to have affirmed the things that you believed and your parents believed and your ancestors and so on. You go to school to achieve precisely the opposite, right? You go to school to have your mind blown by teachers who are willing to say that what you think you know may not in fact be true. And that at a minimum, it is their responsibility as teachers to challenge you every step of the way. I went to the University of Chicago, the son of fairly conservative parents, and I had a lot of Karl Marx in my intellectual diet, okay? Now, maybe there was a risk that I'd become a Marxist because you read, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and you know that history always repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I can recite Marx, right? And I'm glad I read him. I'm glad I read Marx as a perspective, not the perspective, as a lens through which to see the world, not the only lens through which to see the world. And I want to say, critical theory, critical justice theory, critical social theories are a lens. And I think it behooves, especially those of us who are in this room, to understand what it is they're saying and to have the humility, since a lot of people like to talk about humility, to have the humility to say, okay, well, what can we learn from this? What is it saying? Is it at least interesting? Is it thought-provoking? In many respects, it is interesting and thought-provoking. Where I draw the line is when it becomes the only way in which students are allowed to see the world. So teach it by all means. And I think it's something for a conference like this to say, if it's diversity of thought, teach that. But insist that there's a multiplicity of perspectives. Insist that contrary views also be taught and also be welcomed. That if you are not on side here, that you are also included in this conversation. Because there's nothing more Orwellian to say that we are tolerant except of you and you and you, and we are inclusive except of you and you and you. Okay, this is where you get into the real territory of the totalitarians.
Yeah, well put. I feel like applauding, actually. That was very good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So you've touched on a number of sort of civic and personal virtues, actually, in this conversation, and it's consonant with the research that I'm doing on habits of a free mind. And so I'm just going to sort of point to those, because I think that as parents and educators, these are things that we can not only teach to children, but things that we can model ourselves even in these difficult conversations. And so the first thing that you talked about was curiosity. And I think it's so important that we not get stuck in certitude that we're right about this, right? We have to be, come from a position of being able to learn something from the people with whom we disagree. And this is a one-way street. We cannot make that contingent on them being willing to learn from us. It has to be that we are unconditionally willing to learn something. And as it happens, it just works out that when you approach people that way, they tend to become more open to hearing from you. But if that's your only goal, it doesn't work. And so kind of listening for understanding and for being able to accurately reflect what they say in a way that's that somebody who was hearing you make their argument wouldn't know it wasn't your own. If you can do that, then you really understand. Like, you could make the argument for communism, having learned it that way.
Yeah, you know, and this is such an important point that you raise, which is that in order to disagree well, you first have to understand well.
Yeah.
You know, the great disagreements in the world, whether it's between Plato and Aristotle or between Locke and Hobbes, take place over centuries. And one thing you'll never find Locke doing is misunderstanding his teacher, Hobbes. Mm. It's only through that kind of deep comprehension that, you know, comes out of curiosity and a certain kind of empathy, by the way, that you can have the sort of disagreements that you want to foster. And I love that phrase of yours, habits of a free mind.
Well, this was actually Greg Lukianoff gave me that title. That's the title of my project, and so thank you to Greg.
Is he in the room?
He's not here. He was here earlier.
Screw him. That's your phrase. You know, it's a great line from T.S. Eliot, you know, inferior poets plagiarize, great poets steal.
I will always be inferior.
T.S. Eliot was an anti-Semite, by the way, and yet I think he's a great poet. And so, by the way, I mentioned that just to say that just because some of your intellectual heroes have serious moral defects doesn't mean that you have to throw out everything they've ever thought or written. You know, people are made of various things, and you can learn from morally imperfect people. But, you know, just to get to this thought, like the habit of a free mind, Aristotle teaches us that we become virtuous through habituation, yeah. Right? Habituation is the practice of acting in a certain way. How do you become courageous? You do courageous things. Right. How do you do that? Well, you do it, and then you discover that it's a mean between cowardice and you know, being excessively headstrong and so on. And I think, you know, you're in a position, I know, Pamela, from reading you, of like elaborating a sense of ideas of what those core habits are. So I'm curious to hear from you. You mentioned curiosity is one. What are the other habits of a free mind?
And you've pointed to all three of the main virtues or habits. So the one that you just talked about just a minute ago was empathy. Compassion is how I would put that. There's a Jewish principle, machlochet l'shem shamayim. That's argument for the sake of heaven. That's a way of relating to the people that we disagree with, like we're thinking partners, that we're on the same side in the search for truth. And even if they do not see truth the same way, we can use our disagreements with them in our search for truth. And we can see them as equally human. I know there's been some discussion of dignity, but I missed some of it. But there's a lot of conversation about human dignity, and this is another thing that I think may start to get captured, and I think we need to claim it. That we need to treat everybody with equal human dignity. That means that standards apply, regardless of identity. And also it means that identity does not have to be defined the way that it's currently being defined. People used to have an identity as like a mother. I'm a mother first, as opposed to whatever race or, and so then we had identities that we could relate to. Identity was also something that we were passionate about. Like somebody was passionate about solving hunger, then they could find common cause with people and a shared sense of identity and meaning around that cause. Being a Little League coach was, people had these things that they cared about that gave their lives meaning, that became, what an identity is, something that you identify with so closely that it feels like who you are. So that's not just things that other people say you are. It's not just the ways in which other people identify you. It's the ways in which you identify yourself.
It's also identity as something you choose, not something that you are given. Just listening to you, I'm often struck by a different thought. This goes back to an earlier question about why it's so difficult to have these conversations. And one of the things I think about is the tyranny of nice.
Right.
We're Americans, so, well, most of us, but there was an Englishman by the cough, so the English don't need to be nice. And I say that for a reason, because I was a devotee of American Idol back in the day when Simon Cowell was a judge. And there were, at the time that I used to watch it, there was Paula Abdul, who was one judge, Randy Jackson, another, and then there was Simon Cowell. And Paula Abdul was the apotheosis of nice. These people would stand up and sing and they sucked. She'd say, sweetie, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you're special, maybe a little pitchy in parts, but feel great about yourself. Jackson's analysis was fairly technical. And then there was Cowell, who was supposed to be the jerk. Right? I actually thought Cowell was the kindest person in the room, because he would say, you suck, go away, run from this profession before you spend the next 10 years of your life making the mistake of thinking you're a singer, only to wake up at 3 a.m. in some terrible cabaret show at a motel in Reno and realizing that you have wasted your life, you're never gonna be able to go to law school or do anything else because people have been nice to you without being kind to you. And kindness begins by telling you a truth that you might not necessarily want to hear. And I think that's an important point, that the confrontation with a certain kind of truth is sort of the essence of what education is about. Those truths are often hard, but most of us, I think, in our experience, when we think of sort of touchstone moments in our lives, we think there are moments when we ran up against the truth. I never forget organic chemistry, when I suddenly realized I'm not that smart. Right? I thought I was smart, but I'm not that smart, right? I just can't figure it out. It was actually a very, very useful moment because I went into a profession of idiots and succeeded.
I have to say, I'm distracted by the fact that you, Bret Stephens of the New York Times, was a devotee of American Idol. I mean, that's
It's a great show.
Great. Yeah, well, I liked it, but, we find new things out about people all the time. So you also mentioned, I mean, this gets right to the heart of one of the things that people have been talking about throughout this conference, which is courage. And that is the third of the three virtues or habits of a free mind. Courage. And courage is not something that you can learn how to enact in an academic way. You can't learn it from reading about courageous people, like I'm going to do these things that a courageous person did and then I'll be courageous. It's something that that you need to, like you said, practice, and you practice it by doing something courageous. And what is something courageous? It's something where you put something at risk. And getting back to our first kind of part of this conversation is the things that people are afraid of are risking those things, right? We're afraid to risk our reputation. We're afraid to risk our jobs, our livelihood. We're afraid to risk our kids' position in a school or the kids' ability to get into another school, into college. And then there are some things that are more important. And when that thing becomes more important, then we're willing to risk those other things. And that's what takes courage.
You're also willing to be courageous on behalf of things that are right and true.
Exactly.
And one of the ways in which I think this argument has become complex is that people feel it's somehow not just déclassé, but somehow dirty to say, well, hang on a second, okay? I want to believe that the education that our children are getting is an education based in rigor, based in fairness, based in the spirits of an open mind, right? That it is not a pedagogy, it is not an ideology pretending to be a pedagogy. Right. And that's the essence of what a liberal and open society does. We do not want to train our children to be cadres. I would urge all of you to read memoirs about the Cultural Revolution in China. Read Nian Cheng's Life and Death in Shanghai, to see what the outcome can be when you turn kids into militants. And not only the worst kind of militant, which is the militant for whom it has never occurred that he or she, whatever their pronouns are, might be wrong, okay? The most useful thought that a liberal education offers you is that question mark in the back of your head that says, I could be wrong about things I believe so deeply. And the truly liberally educated person is willing to hold their convictions, but lightly enough to accept that they might be in error. And therefore the requirement is to have a capacity to change your mind. Yeah. And that capacity is vanishing from students. I mean, I meet these young people and they start lecturing me, and that's fine. I'm happy to be lectured, and I'm happy to listen to them, and I don't want to counter-lecture, mansplain them, age-splain them, whatever splaining happens, right? But it just kind of strikes me a little bit that at the age of 16, they appear to have imbibed all the wisdom and certainly all of the moral virtues that are required in their minds to lead a moral life. And that happens not to be true. And what education is supposed to do is basically kick your ass and make you realize you're not as smart as you think, you are wrong about certain things, and the trick, and here's the devil of the problem, you don't know what you're wrong about, right? That's the nub of the problem. So I think that's what's required. A, it's courage, but B, it ought to be a conviction that what you're arguing for is the essence of kindness, of decency, of the interests of a society in which people of very diverse viewpoints, backgrounds, and identities can get along and still exercise the meaning of freedom.
Yeah, very well put. Well put. Yeah. I want to get to questions. Before we get to questions, I just wanted to say one last thing about courage, which is that when you put these three things together, curiosity and compassion and courage, you get a very powerful mix. It's a very powerful combination. And one of the things that I really want everybody in this room to think about is that there are a number of people in this room who have had the courage to kick a door open for us. And that door is going to swing shut if enough people don't go through that door. And that is a very, very important opening that we need to keep open. And so first of all, kudos to everybody who has spoken here today who kicked that door open for the rest of us. And second of all, for those of us who may be less willing to take the risks for whatever very good reasons, I just want people to think about what the costs are of staying silent, because we're thinking so much right now about the costs of speaking up. And I'd like people to think about what the costs are of not speaking up. And think too, what if nobody spoke up? And then think, who are you expecting to speak up? Maybe other people are expecting you to speak up, and then they will follow you through that door. So that's what I want to leave you with before we take questions.
We are going to go to questions, and again, I'm going to hijack as the MC and ask the first question. So, Bret, you mentioned something about, I believe you said T.S. Eliot was an anti-Semite, but you think he wrote good poetry. And I often use that analogy saying that, because somebody has flaws doesn't mean, you go to a restaurant and the chef cooks this wonderful meal and you find out that he's a racist. As a black man, I don't instantly say that recipe doesn't work and tear it up. But, we have that, but don't you believe, I think, I could be wrong, I'm not, but that they're also replacing these people because they have more moral flaws, the founders, we have to get rid of Jefferson. And we replace them with something, they're renaming schools and all that stuff. But we're replacing them with people who have moral flaws. So why don't they see that?
Well, that's a great question. I was thinking about this not long ago when there was a brouhaha over a biography of Philip Roth, the novelist. And it turned out that the man who had written the biography was accused of sexual assault. Not convicted, accused of sexual assault. And so Norton pulled the biography, which I thought was scandalous because the biography lives or dies irrespective of what the biographer does. But I also thought, what Norton also publishes? Publishes one of the great books of the last 60 years, which is Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. Mm-hmm. Now, Cleaver, in the book, admits to going around raping women. It's not a pleasant read, this book, okay? I mean, this is like really hard stuff, and yet how impoverished would we be if Norton said, okay, every author we have who has, some damnable moral flaw from our perspective, and by the way, any perspective, it was wrong to rape in 1960, right. Whatever, than it is today, is going to be removed. You know what you get? Remember when the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas in Bamiyan? That's the kind of thinking that you end up with. It's frightening what you end up losing. Dostoevsky, another anti-Semite. If you read Dostoevsky's works, you'll occasionally find nasty comments about Jews. Racism, this country is saturated with racism. I mean, saturated with racism. And by the way to deal with it is to acknowledge it, to point it out, to make the conversation deeper and more complex. But what bothers me is the answer is, let's not make the conversation deeper and complex. Let's erase and shut down. And that seems to me like a profoundly, that's the Taliban. That's what the Taliban did and what it's about to do again in Afghanistan. That's surely not the kind of outcome that anyone wants the moment they start thinking about it. And you know when this ends? It ends when the erasers start getting erased. Mm-hmm. the French terror ended when Maximilien Robespierre got his head cut off, right? Eventually, all the people who are today the quote unquote woke enforcers, okay, are going to turn out to have their own dirty laundry, their own transgressions, and at some point it reaches a fever pitch and then it dies down. I hope it doesn't have to happen, okay? I hope for the sake of the people who are now trying to enforce an orthodoxy that it doesn't come to them, because cancellation, reputational annihilation is a very unpleasant thing. It's more profoundly unpleasant, I suspect, than many forms of physical hardship.
That's true. Right here.
So I had a question about, so you talked about interrogation and asking, what is diversity? Or what is included in this diversity, or what's inclusive and whatnot? And, you talk about sort of an interrogation that we over here at the West have sort of developed, coming back at each other with questions and coming towards a truth at the end of those questions. But my question is, how do you do that with those who are woke when there's an epistemological barrier where questions to find knowledge, asking questions is actually racist, and you must listen no matter what?
Can I ask you to stand up so we can see you?
And the lights, it's kind of
Yeah,
hard,
I know.
right?
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah, there we
it's
are.
like you're like way behind the cleat
Way
lights,
back.
so.
Yeah. So,
So this is a very, very good question. And this is a sort of paradox, right? Because one of the things that we as people who sort of participate in a kind of epistemology that tethers truth claims to something objective, can't participate in the same kind of dialogue with somebody whose epistemology doesn't do that, right? So that's where compassion is the most important thing to start with. To say, I don't know exactly how to frame this, right? But to start with, can you say more about that? Something like that, right? You don't have to say you don't have to ask any kind of difficult, challenging pushback, but an interrogation of the concept can start with, when you say diversity, can you say more about that? Can you say more about what you're talking about? And gently and humanely have a conversation. You might not get very far, but the idea is to try your best. And if it ends with, I'm not Google, it's not my job to educate you or whatever, if it ends with that, it ends with that. I mean, you try not to get to that point, but if it ends with that, it ends with that. You've gotten as far as you can, and Google it. If you really don't understand exactly what they're talking about, then read. Read the Introduction to Critical Race Theory. Read stuff. Read Kimberly Crenshaw. Read the material on which this stuff is based. And you can then ask questions that interrogate the concept from within that paradigm. So then ask, well, what about what about standpoint epistemology? Does that mean that I, with a different perspective, get to say the thing that I believe because I have a different background than you do? I mean,
yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I have a second question as well for Bret. I had the privilege of writing for Barry Weiss over the summer, and she talked about how she left the New York Times. I mean, that's why she started her Substack originally. And I was informed by Andrew here that you still work for the New York Times. And so I sort of wanted to hear sort of your experience dealing with those who may not like you for your opinions over at the New York Times.
You opened the door, they brought in McWhorter now. You're a trailblazer.
I know. They finally got someone really smart. I mean, this is, I joke about this, but at least before the pandemic, I would sometimes get into the elevator of the Times, and sometimes I'd be with just one other person, and they would lean into me and they'd say, "I like your column."
Look at the camera.
So, look, I don't think it's a secret that I am ideologically to one side of most of my colleagues, or many of my colleagues, and that is not always a comfortable experience. On the other hand, I'm a person who's never really minded being hated. And I find it weird. I mean, the weird moments for me at the Times come when, on the rare occasions I write a column and most of the feedback is positive. And you think, what the hell did I do wrong? Look, the New York Times is the most important newspaper in the world. Whether you love it, hate it, or somewhere in between, it is the most important paper in the world. And I think it's important, especially now that they have voices that grate on the nerves of some of their readers, because that's also the business of journalism. A newspaper isn't a warm bath, right? And the moment it becomes a warm bath, it's not journalism anymore. It's certainly not real opinion journalism. So I guess I'm the splash of cold water in the warm bath, and you know, I like to say so far so good, but I think that's the answer to the joke about the guy who jumps off the Empire State Building at the 50th floor. The guy's like, "How are you doing? So far so good."
We have time for
Thank
one
you.
more.
Here in front.
Well, she's bringing a mic to somebody else. I'm waiting to see who she's bringing. She's bringing you a mic, Elena. I'm not ignoring you. You have the floor.
A quick comment, and I actually would like to build a little
Why
bit
ask a
on that.
question? You can make a comment.
So, yeah. On one of the things that you spoke about, I tell my people in my organization, No Left Turn in Education, not to really get bogged down on really CRT, no CRT, but to do exactly what you've been talking about what they're actually teaching. Is it right or is it wrong? And they call it different names. And on our website, we have a glossary. I call it CRT code words, and with explanation and even citation, definition and citation of over 100 of those words that they are using instead of CRT. And what we need to find out is really what are they teaching. So that's important. The comment, because obviously both of you are Jewish, and I didn't know that you're too, and I'm Israeli. It blows my mind, the behavior of Jews in light of all this. I don't understand the synagogues with BLM signs, and our rabbi bringing a BLM person to explain, you know, a lot of things. So it's not presented really as another opinion necessarily. And I would like to see your take of how to explain the standing and behavior of a lot of Jews on this issue.
You're Jewish, Pamela? Look, I've thought about this a bit. So I think that there are a number of trends associated with what we're speaking about that I think are concerning no matter what your background is, but maybe particularly concerning for Jews in light of our history, not just in the United States, but globally. And I would say there are 4 aspects of it. Number one, to the extent that the new discourse is so overwhelmingly focused on race, it is doing so at the expense of what used to be ethnicity. So there was once a time when there were Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, you know, big salad bowl or whatever, right? And you kind of existed in this salad bowl. And by the way, Jews have a very long history of being discriminated against in the United States. I mean, it's not the discrimination that African Americans face, but there was redlining. There were no hire policies at the State Department, white shoe law firms, all kinds of things. And it was part of that experience. Now, Jews are, I think many Jews, people who are Ashkenazi Jews, find themselves being shunted into a racial category that, at least in my case, I don't recognize as my own. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. How is it that I am now supposed to have a white identity that I supposedly share with the people who at Charlottesville were chanting Jews will not replace us, right? I don't want to belong to that same identity, right? So that's one aspect, the move from the kind of the racialization of discourse, which I think, by the way, is just toxic all around. There's another aspect, which is that there's so much of what is now CRT that is essentially opposed to the spirit of independent thinking. And you mentioned argument for the sake of heaven. There is a long Jewish tradition, whether you want to go back rabbinically or even in American history, of kind of impishness, irreverence, dissent, activism that just resists the trends towards intellectual monoculture. And so that's another aspect. Third aspect that worries me is this word privilege. Jews in Germany in the 1920s were privileged. 1930s, not so much. So this term privilege has to be interrogated because there's nothing more vulnerable. Well, I don't want to say there's nothing more vulnerable, but one category of vulnerable is people who have wealth without political power. Because the easiest thing then is for political power to destroy the wealth. So this term privilege that we keep bandying about, I think should be concerning, because privilege is, unless it's wedded to some absolute fixed social caste, is a much more vulnerable category than we realize. Let me give you an example. Last I checked, Jewish students were 16% of the Yale student body. Jews are at most 2.4% of the American population. So in the name of dethroning privilege, should Yale simply say, we're going to have a cap on Jewish students, no more than 2.4%, irrespective of merit, irrespective of any other consideration. So that's the third aspect. And the fourth thing that worries me, and this is beyond CRT, is the rise in conspiracy thinking in the United States. And this is, by the way, not just a global phenomenon, it is a bipartisan phenomenon, right? Whether you believe in the rigged election of 2020 or in 9/11 trutherism, I can think of a million conspiracies. But, and this is a point that I think Pamela has made very powerfully, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. Anti-Zionism is a conspiracy theory. A country that will believe anything about anything, right, will believe the worst about Jews. And so, yes, I mean, I take your point profoundly that this is not something that is just, of interest generally. It's also very much of interest to the, and now I'm just speaking Jewishly, right, of interest to Jews, because, again, there's this kind of rhyming, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Ideologies don't repeat themselves, but they rhyme. And there's a certain kind of rhyming quality here in terms of modes of thought that are really worrying. I mean, people have talked about Jews as the proverbial canaries in the coal mine, right? No disrespect to coal mines or canaries or so forth, but that's I think another deeply concerning aspect. But this is not a Jewish issue. This is an American issue. And I want to just sort of close on, if this is the last question, I just want to close on this note. This concerns everyone of any race, any ethnicity, any identity. People want to be, in my view, appreciated, respected, tested, even failed on what they have inside, right? They want honesty at some level. They want genuine fair play. They want to be judged by who they are as men or women, not as a racial category to be treated in one way or to be treated in another. That seems like the essence of why people ultimately think that the United States is an experiment worth saving. And if you lose that, you're in trouble.
Pamela Paresky, Bret Stephens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great meeting you. Great. Thanks.